What would you do if you accidentally walked into the most powerful and feared Alpha King's private bath chamber, stripped down, sank into the warm water thinking you were completely alone, and then heard the door open? Not a servant, not a guard. Him, the king himself, standing in the doorway, filling it like he was built for it, with iron gray eyes that didn't blink and a jaw that didn't move and the kind of silence that makes your whole body forget how breathing works. You have two choices in that moment. Run, or stay completely, desperately still and hope he thinks you belong there. Ren chose wrong, and somehow, impossibly, that wrong choice turned out to be the only right thing she'd done in 3 years of running. This is the story of a girl who crawled through a window to escape a forced marriage, walked through the wrong door in a stranger's castle, and ended up in the bath of the one man in the entire kingdom with both the power to destroy her and the will to protect her instead. And the mate bond neither of them saw coming. Stay with me, because chapter 1 starts right now, and I promise you, you will not see the ending coming. Chapter 1. The water was still warm when she heard the door. Ren had only meant to find an empty room. After 3 days on the eastern road with blistered feet, a stolen cloak, and a name she borrowed from a girl she'd met at a crossroads in, she was running on cold air and desperation. She'd slipped into Castle Greymantle through the servants' gate just before nightfall, told the half-asleep steward she was new staff sent up from the lowlands, and been waved toward the inner corridors without a second glance. The bathing chamber at the end of the upper hall had looked empty. The door had been unlocked. The fire inside had already been lit, the copper tub already filled, steam curling off the surface like an invitation. After 72 hours of frozen roads and wet boots and the constant cold terror of being followed, Ren had looked at that water and made the single most catastrophic decision of her life. She had not seen the royal crest carved into the stone above the hearth. She had not noticed the king's seal pressed into the wax of the folded letters on the side table. She had not thought to wonder why a bathing chamber would be so finely appointed, so perfectly prepared, so clearly waiting for someone who was not her. She found out exactly who it was waiting for the moment the door opened, and the room went quiet in a way rooms only go quiet when someone very powerful walks into them. Ren froze. The water lapped softly against the copper edge of the tub. The fire cracked in the grate, and in the doorway stood a man who took up the entire frame of it, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, still damp at the temples from the cold outside. Looking at her with iron gray eyes that didn't widen, didn't blink, didn't do anything at all except take in the sight of a complete stranger sitting in his bath like she'd been placed there by the gods themselves as some kind of personal test. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Ren counted them. Her voice came out cracked and small, barely a sound at all. I didn't know this was. I'm so sorry. I thought the room was empty. I'll go. Please just. If you could turn around for 1 moment, I'll be out of your sight before you. Stay where you are. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening, precisely. It was worse than threatening. It was the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had never once in its life needed to repeat itself, and it landed on Ren like a hand pressed flat to the back of her neck, and her body obeyed it before her mind had even finished processing the words. She stayed. He stepped fully into the room and pulled the door shut behind him with a soft, deliberate click that echoed off the stone walls like a full stop at the end of a sentence she hadn't known was being written. He didn't come closer. He stood with his back against the door, arms folding slowly over his chest, and studied her with the unhurried patience of a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. You're not one of my staff, he said. Not a question. Ren's stomach dropped. No. And you're not a thief. A thief would have taken something and run. I just wanted a bath, she heard herself say, and immediately wished she could reach into the air and take it back because it was possibly the least dignified sentence ever spoken in the history of desperate situations. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, swiftly controlled. How long have you been in my castle? Less than an hour. Who let you in? A steward at the east gate. He didn't ask many questions. She hesitated. I think he may have been asleep. The not-quite smile threatened to surface again and was suppressed again. The king unfolded his arms and crossed the room in 4 long, unhurried strides, and Wren's hands gripped the edge of the copper tub hard enough to whiten her knuckles as he stopped beside the wooden bench, lifted the heavy fur draped across it, and held it out toward her without looking away from her face. Get out of the tub, he said. There's dry clothing in the chest by the fire. Put something on and sit down. A pause. Then you're going to tell me who you are, what you're running from, and why you chose my castle to hide in. In that order. Wren stared at him. You're not going to throw me in a dungeon. I haven't decided yet. His eyes moved over her face slowly, carefully, reading something that she couldn't name. You're shaking, and your feet, when you stand up, are going to tell me you've been walking for days. I don't throw injured women in dungeons before I've heard their story. He set the fur down on the bench within her reach and turned his back, facing the fire. I'll give you privacy. You have 2 minutes. Wren moved faster than she'd moved in 3 days. By the time she was wrapped in the fur and the dry wool he'd indicated, her wet hair dripping down her back and her heart beat somewhere in the vicinity of her throat, Alaric, though she didn't yet know to call him that, had settled into the carved chair beside the fire and poured 2 cups of something hot from the pot on the hearth. He held one out to her without ceremony. She took it because her hands needed something to hold. Start from the beginning, he said. Wren looked at this man she had never seen before in her life. This alpha king of the Hollowwood whose bath she had stolen and whose patience she was apparently now also borrowing, and understood that she was going to tell him the truth. Not because she trusted him, she didn't know him. Not because she had no other choice, she could still run. But because something in the way he'd handed her the fur, and turned his back without being asked, and spoken to her like she was a person rather than a problem, had cracked open the 3 years of careful silence she'd been living inside. My name is Wren, she said. My father sold me to Lord Casterthorne to settle a debt I had no part in making. The wedding was in 3 days. I climbed out of a window 2 nights ago, and I have been walking north ever since. She wrapped both hands around the cup. I chose your castle because it was the first gate I found unlocked. That is the whole truth. I have no other plan. I have no allies, no money, and no idea what I am going to do next. The fire shifted in the grate. Alaric looked at her for a long moment, and she braced for the calculation she'd learned to expect from men. The weighing of her usefulness, the assessment of her value as a bargaining piece, the quiet arithmetic of what she was worth to keep versus what she was worth to retain. It didn't come. Casterthorne, he said instead, voice going very even, very quiet, the way a fire goes quite right before it catches on something new. Thorne sent his men north through my territory 3 days ago. I was told they were hunting a runaway horse. Wren's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. They were not, Alaric continued, hunting a horse. His iron-gray eyes settled on her face with a weight that was not unkind and not careless and not anything she had a word for. He's already looking for you. He'll reach my border inside 2 days. A pause. The fire popped. Which means you are not, in fact, leaving in an hour. My lord, I can't stay here. If he finds me in your castle, he'll use it as an excuse to start a war with me. Alaric's jaw tightened. Yes, I'm aware of what Thorne would do with the excuse. I'm also aware that sending you back out onto that road sends you directly into the hands of the men looking for you. He set down his own cup and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at her steadily. I have a third option. Wren waited. You stay, under my protection, formally declared, which makes you untouchable under the laws of this kingdom. Thorne can come to my gates and demand you returned, and I will look him in the eye and tell him exactly what I think of men who sell women to settle debts." Something moved behind his eyes, sharp and certain, and for a moment the careful restraint he wore like a second skin slipped just enough for her to see what lived underneath it. "I have been waiting for a reason to have that conversation with Casterthorn for 6 years. You've walked into my bath and handed me one." Ren stared at him. "You'd do that for a stranger?" Alaric held her gaze for one long, still moment, and something passed across his face she couldn't yet interpret. Something surprised, something searching, something that looked almost like recognition looking for a word to attach itself to. "I find," he said quietly, "that you are not feeling like a stranger." The fire burned. Outside, wind pressed against the high stone windows of Castle Greymantle and found no way through. And Ren, who had spent 3 years learning how to make herself small enough to disappear, sat in the chair across from a king who had not once, in the span of a single hour, looked at her like she was less than exactly what she was. She didn't trust it yet. She didn't trust anything yet. But she pulled the fur tighter around her shoulders and didn't get up to leave. And that, as it turned out, was how everything began. Belle, he just declared that he's keeping her, and neither of them understands why he means it so completely. Chapter 2 is where the real danger starts and where that bond makes its first move. Subscribe now so it comes straight to your feed the moment it drops. Trust me, you don't want to start Chapter 2 late. Chapter 2. She did not sleep well and was not surprised. The chamber they'd given her was warm, and the bed was the finest she'd slept in since her mother was alive. And none of that mattered at all because every time she closed her eyes she heard the door open again and saw those iron gray eyes and felt the floor tilt beneath her the way it had the moment he'd said "You are not feeling like a stranger" in a voice that made it sound less like a pleasantry and more like something he was only just understanding about himself. By the time the castle began to wake around her, distant footsteps, the low toll of a morning bell, the smell of wood smoke and bread finding its way under the door, Ren had already been sitting at the window for an hour, watching the fog settle over the valley below Greymantle's walls and thinking about every decision that had led her here. 3 years ago, she had been a merchant's daughter with ink-stained fingers and a garden she tended herself and a future she had believed, naively, was hers to decide. Then her father's ships had gone down in the northern strait, and the debts had come due, and Casterthorn had knocked on their door with a smile and a contract and the particular patience of a man who already knows the answer is yes. She had said no. Twice. Loudly and without apology. Her father had said yes on her behalf. And so she had spent 3 years learning to make herself very small and very quiet, counting the days until a wedding she wanted no part of, planning an escape she hadn't been sure she was brave enough to make, until the night 3 days ago when she'd finally looked at the window of her room at Housethorn and thought, the only thing on the other side of that is the dark and the cold and the chance of something different. And she had gone through it before she could talk herself back to bed. She still wasn't sure she was brave. She suspected what she was simply more afraid of staying than she was of running. There was a difference, and it mattered, and she'd spent 7 to 2 hours on a frozen road reminding herself of it. A knock at the door pulled her from the window. It was not Alaric. It was a young woman in castle livery, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who had been specifically instructed not to ask questions, carrying a breakfast tray and a folded message sealed in dark wax. She set the tray on the table, placed the message beside it, and withdrew without a word. Ren broke the seal. "My council meets at the first hour. You will want to eat before then. There are things you should hear, and I find I prefer to have you in the room than to explain them after the fact. A. Not a summons, precisely. Not an order, but written in the hand of a man who was accustomed to both and had chosen, deliberately, to phrase it as neither." Ren read it twice. Then she ate, because she hadn't properly eaten in 3 days and her hands had been shaking since before the bath. And then she smoothed the front of the borrowed dress and went to find out what kind of trouble her accident had started. The council chamber of Castle Greymantle was a long, cold room with high windows that let in more grey light than warmth, and a table that had clearly witnessed centuries of serious men making serious decisions and being serious about it. When Wren was shown in, 5 of those serious men turned to look at her with the kind of unified attention that made her feel she had walked into a room that had been discussing her extensively. She kept her chin up. She had learned in the halls of House Thorn that the moment you let someone see you shrink, you never fully stood straight again. Alaric was at the head of the table. He looked different in daylight, in council clothes, with the full weight of his authority settled around him like a cloak, more like the fearsome alpha king she'd heard rumors of on the road, and less like the man who had handed her a fur without being asked and turned his back to give her privacy. The iron-gray eyes found her the moment she entered, and something in them shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a fire shifts when a new piece of wood catches, and then went steady again. "Gentlemen," he said, without looking away from her, "this is Wren. She is a guest of Greymantle under formal declaration of protection, effective last night. You will treat her accordingly." The men around the table exchanged looks. One of them, lean and sharp-faced with silver at his temples and the cold, assessing eyes of someone who made it his professional purpose to notice things, did not exchange a look with anyone. He simply watched Wren the way a hawk watches something moving through grass. Wren had seen that look before, in Lord Thorn's right-hand man, and it had never once meant anything good. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying the pleasant smoothness of someone who had learned long ago that objections land better when they don't sound like objections, a guest taken in overnight without council consultation under a formal protection declaration. "Lord Hadrick." Alaric's voice was courteous and immovable. "I am aware of what I did and why I did it. Your consultation is not required for my use of my own guest rights in my own castle." Lord Hadrick inclined his head. His eyes did not leave Wren. "Sit down, please." Alaric indicated the empty chair to his left, and Wren crossed the room and sat, aware of every set of eyes tracking her, and folded her hands on the table in her lap so no one could see them want to shake. "Thorn's advance party reached our southern border post at dawn," Alaric continued, addressing the table now. "They are requesting right of pursuit under the Anti-Territory Accord, claiming recovery of runaway property." The last 2 words came out with a flatness that made the temperature in the room drop a degree. "I have declined. They are waiting at the border post for my formal response." He looked around the table. "I'll be sending it within the hour. I intend to inform Lord Thorn that the woman he refers to as property is a guest of this castle under my personal protection, and that his men are welcome to turn around." "And if Thorn escalates," said another lord, heavier set and pragmatic-faced, "we're looking at a border dispute at minimum, possibly a formal grievance to the High Council." "He can grieve all he likes," Alaric said. "He sold a woman against her will and called it a contract. The High Council has no mechanism for enforcing that, and Thorn knows it, which is why he's calling her property instead of a betrothed. He's hoping I won't look closely at the wording." "You looked closely," Wren said quietly. She hadn't meant to speak. Every head turned toward her. She met Alaric's eyes across the table. "You read the wording before this meeting." "Last night," he said, equally quiet, and something about the simplicity of it, the fact that he had, while she slept badly in a warm borrowed bed, sat up and read every word of the document that bound her to Thorn and looked for every crack in it, pressed against her chest in a way she didn't have armor for. "There are 3 grounds on which it is unenforceable. I intend to use all 3. Lord Hadrick's stylus paused on his parchment. "You've given this considerable thought, my lord, for a woman taken in less than 12 hours ago." The room went the specific kind of quiet that falls when someone says out loud the thing everyone is thinking, but no one is supposed to say. Wren kept her eyes on the table. Alaric, she noted from her peripheral vision, kept his on Hadrick, steady and without expression, with the patience of a man who didn't need to justify himself and had no intention of starting. "I have, Lord Hadrick," he said simply. "Thank you for noticing." The matter was not raised again. But Wren felt Hadrick's gaze on the side of her face for the rest of the meeting, cold and precise as the tip of a blade, and understood, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent 3 years learning to read a room, that he was not finished. She found the library by accident, which seemed to be becoming a pattern. After the council meeting had ended and Alaric had been immediately descended upon by 3 separate advisors with 3 separate crises that all apparently required his attention that very moment, Wren had been gently redirected toward the main corridor and left to her own devices in a castle she didn't know. She'd taken the stage she recognized, turned left instead of right, and ended up in a long, vaulted room lined floor to ceiling with shelves, a fire burning at the far end, a worn rug on the stones, and no one in it at all. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in, ran her fingers along the spines of the nearest shelf, pulled out something thick and old about the water routes of the Northern Strait, and sat down on the floor in front of the fire because the chairs all looked like they belonged to important people, and she was still, despite everything, a merchant's daughter in a borrowed dress. She was 3 chapters in when the door opened. She looked up expecting a servant. She got Alaric, still in his council clothes, looking faintly surprised to find her there, and then, very quickly, faintly something else. Something she clocked and filed away and told herself firmly she was not going to examine. "You found the library," he said. "I find rooms by accident," Wren said. "It's apparently what I do." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. He crossed to the fire, and instead of taking the large carved chair nearest it, the obvious choice, the one that was clearly his, he lowered himself to sit on the rug a few feet from her with his back against the chair's leg, in the manner of a man who had grown up in this room and had a long history with this particular rug. He reached out and tilted the cover of her book to see the title, and when he saw it, something unguarded moved across his face. "My father's," he said. He spent 20 years trying to reopen the northern trade routes. He had that book half memorized. A pause. He died before he managed it. Wren looked at him. In the council chamber he had been the Alpha King, all contained authority and immovable calm. Here, by the fire on the floor of the library where he had clearly spent a significant portion of his childhood, he was only a man with a complicated inheritance and a dead father and a book that had belonged to someone he missed. The contrast was dizzying and oddly intimate, and she felt instinctively that very few people ever got to see the difference. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it plainly. "He would have liked you," Alaric said, and seemed as surprised to say it as she was to hear it. He looked at the fire. He respected people who were honest about what they were running from. Said it took more courage to name a fear than to pretend it didn't exist. "I'm not sure I'm courageous," Wren said. "I think I was just more scared of staying." "That is," Alaric said, almost to himself, "exactly what courage is." The fire shifted. The castle settled around them in its old stone quiet. Somewhere outside, a long way south, Thorne's men were waiting at a border post for an answer they were not going to like. And in here, the Alpha King of the Hollowwood sat on his library floor in his council clothes with a woman he'd known for less than a day and made no move to leave. "Can I ask you something?" Wren said. He looked at her. "You can ask me anything." "Why does Lord Hadrick dislike me?" Alaric was quiet for a moment. "Hadrick doesn't dislike you. He doesn't know you. What Hadrick dislikes is anything that enters this castle without his prior knowledge and full assessment. He has kept me safe since I was 16 years old, and he takes it extremely personally when something surprises him." A pause. "You surprised him?" "I surprised everyone, including myself." "Yes." His eyes stayed on her face. "The difference is that most people were surprised and then moved on. Hadrick is still trying to work out what you are. And you? Ren asked, before she could stop herself. Are you still trying to work out what I am? The question sat between them in the firelight, and Alaric looked at her for a long, still moment with those iron-gray eyes that never seemed to do anything carelessly, and she braced for something deflecting, something controlled, something that kept the careful distance she'd noticed him maintain with everyone he'd spoken to all morning. What she got instead was the truth. No, he said quietly. That is the part that is making Hadrick nervous. Belle, he just admitted he already knows what she is to him, and Hadrick is watching every second of it. But Thorn hasn't gone home. His men are still at that border, and what they do next changes everything. Subscribe right now, because Chapter 3 is where this stops being a shelter and starts being a war. She was back in her chamber that night, the fire burned low and the castle gone quiet around her, when the knock came. Soft, unhurried, not a servant's knock. Ren crossed to the door and opened it and found Alaric standing in the corridor looking like a man who had started the walk to her room with something specific to say and was now reconsidering every word of it. Thorn's response came an hour ago, he said. She read the answer in his face before he said it. His not turning back. No. His jaw was tight. His sending a formal envoy. 3 days. He'll arrive expecting to negotiate your return. His eyes moved over her face carefully. I want you to know before tomorrow what you're in the middle of. I told you last night I'd protect you, and I meant it, but that protection is going to cost something now. Thorn will make it political. My council will push back. This castle is about to become a complicated place to be. A pause, and then lower. If you want to leave before it becomes that, tell me now and I will get you out through the North Pass tonight. Safe passage, supplies, enough coin to get you somewhere he can't follow. Ren looked at him standing in her doorway, this careful, controlled, iron-eyed king who had turned his back in the bath and sat on the library floor and stayed up reading the legal cracks in a contract that had nothing to do with him, offering her an exit she hadn't asked for. You'd do that, she said slowly. Give me a way out even if it means I go. I'd rather you stayed, he said, and for the first time all day the control slipped completely. No almost smile, no careful steadiness, only the plain undefended truth of it. But what you want matters more than what I'd rather. It has mattered since last night. I find it is not something I can turn off. The bond died deep in her chest, slow and warm, like an ember that had been waiting for air. She hadn't named it yet. She wasn't ready to name it yet. But she felt it the same way she'd felt his voice in the bath chamber. Not in her ears, but in her spine, in the place where her body knew things before her mind was willing to admit them. I'm not leaving, she said. Something moved in his face that she felt rather than saw. Then sleep, he said quietly. Tomorrow is going to be harder. He was already turning to go when she said his name. His actual name, the one she'd learned from a servant that afternoon, the one she hadn't yet tested in her mouth. Alaric. He stopped, turned back. She didn't have anything planned to follow it with. She'd said it because something in her needed to see what his face did when she said it. She saw. She started somewhere safe and private and did not examine it yet. Thank you, she said, for the fight, last night, and for all of the rest of it. Alaric looked at her for a moment in the low corridor light. Get some rest, Ren, he said, and his voice had gone the particular quiet of a man being very deliberate about every word. You're safe here. He walked back down the corridor. She watched him go and then closed the door and stood with her back against it in the dark and pressed both hands flat over the place in her chest where the ember was quietly, irrevocably becoming a flame. Thorn was coming in 3 days. Hadrick was watching her like a puzzle he intended to solve. The council was unconvinced and the border was not quiet, and she was standing in a borrowed room in a stranger's castle with no plan and no allies and every sensible reason in the world to have taken the North Pass when it was offered. She had not taken it. She pressed her hands harder against her chest. The warmth beneath them did not wane. She was beginning to understand that the mistake, the bath, the wrong door, the unlocked gate, the stolen cloak, the window she'd crawled through 3 days ago, none of it had been a mistake at all. She just didn't know yet what it was instead. Thanks for staying through Chapter 2. Things are just starting to move. Thorn's envy, Hadrick's suspicion, and that bun that Ren hasn't named yet but her body already knows. What do you think she should do when Thorn's envoy arrives? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications so Chapter 3 comes straight to you the moment it drops. I post every week. See you then.